This is Gemara Baba Basra Daf Chof Dalid, and we're holding the bottom of Chof Gimel Amid Beis, and most particularly, we're in the middle of discussing the din of Rav Chanina that was at the top of the Amid on the Mishnah. Rav Chanina taught us Raiv V'Karaiv Holchin Achar Haraiv. Big sigyas over here, but comes along Rav Chanina, and he says something called a Raiv, a majority. There's something called Karaiv, which is something in proximity. So the question is, what happens when these two clash? On one hand, we have a Rav telling me the item came from A, and of course, this is within the context of our Mishnah, finding different doves within proximity to their dovecotes, etc., trying to figure out where they should be returned to or not. So said Rav Chanina, when the Rav and the Karaiv clashes, Holchein Achar Haroiv. We tried in the whole Amud Beis really to ask kashas on Rav Chanina, and we pick it up from that particular point. 5 lines from the bottom, Toshima, as the Gemara once again asks on Rav Chanina. Says the Mishnah, what happens? Nimsa bin shnei shayvchais. You find this dove between two different dovecotes, these areas that the doves live. V'karev lezeh, karev lezeh shaloi. If it was closer to this one, shaloi, it belongs to him. Karev lezeh, it's closer to the other one, shaloi, it belongs to him. So says the Gemara, even though one is larger. So what do we see clearly? We see clearly that even though we have a roiv, larger, karoiv, closer, what do we see? We see karoiv is going to win versus the roiv. Akash and Rav Chanina. Answers the Gemara 2 lines from the bottom. Who told you one is bigger? Says the Gemara of Lizbal Alma. Okay, so why don't we go after the Rave of the world, since these birds could have come from anywhere. So therefore, whoever found it should keep it. We have a Rave that it came from the world. We have a Karaiv to a certain area, and yet we're saying what? It goes after the Karaiv. You have to return it to the closer house, dovecote that it could have come from. Why? Go after the Raiv. Says the Gemara, what's going on over here as we turn over to Chav Dalid Amid Aleph. We're talking about that the dove was found in a particular area. Says the Gemara, talking about a case that the dove was found where? Bishvil Shel Karamim. So about a case where it's found in the path between the Karamim in the vineyards, and that is the case that even if it's more than 50 Amais, that there's no reason to assume that it could have flown there. Why? Because it could have hopped by just going next to the vines, and therefore we know it came from one of these two areas. Meaning the Gemara is explaining and creating a hechatimsa that it could not have come from the Raiv of the Alma, because we know that it didn't fly there, it must have hopped there. Explains the Gemara, Demisa me Alma Asim would have came from the world, Kim the Medadi, Lai Matzi, Kim the Medadi Lo Matzi Asi. Since it's only hopping, it's not flying, cannot have come from the world. Chol the Medadi, Vahadar, because a bird hops only as long as they can turn around and go back home. Midadi. That's when it will continue to havi. Loi midadi. And therefore, since it has this vineyard, since it can't look back, and therefore it must have come from one of these two places. So the Gemara is creating a chatimsa that we can know that it didn't come me'alma, and therefore there is no raiv, and that's the reason why we're going with the karaiv, and it's not a kasha on Rav Chanina. Amar Abaye. So the Gemara turns the tables and says, comes along Abaye, and he says, Avanan Nami Tanina, and as Rashi helps us out over here on the last Y line, that we're bringing a raya to Rav Chanina, that what? Raiv Karaiv. We're going to go with the Raiv. Dam Shenitza Beprozdar. We have dam of an ish that's found in the prosdar, the vaginal canal, Sveikoi Tame. If we're not sure where it came from, if it either came from the makar, from the uterus, and therefore it would be tummy, or maybe it came from the aliyah, higher up, and therefore it would be tahar. What's the halacha? The suffix is tummy. Why? Because the chazaka is the dam came from the makar. Even though the aliyah is closer than the makar. You have the vaginal canal, then you have the aliyah, and then you have the makar on top. So if I have dam on the bottom over here, it's closer to assume that it came from the aliyah, and still we're saying we go after the makar. Why? We see we have a karoiv and a roiv. Roiv dam comes from the makar, so we see we go from the roiv. Raya says Abaya to Rav Chanina. Amar le Rava. Rava responds, no Raya. Roiv umatzui ka'amrit. You're talking about a different case. You're talking about a case of roiv and matzui, something that's found more often. Meaning, says Rava, there's an additional factor over here. It's not just roiv versus a kareif. It's roiv and a matzoi versus a kareif. Roiv umatzoi kamrit. Roiv umatzoi lekel amanda amar. There's no one that says that we would go with a kareif in this case. Everyone agrees we go with the roiv. Detani Rav Chia. Dam animsa beproizdar, as we just said, in the vaginal canal. Chayovin olav albias mikdash. Such a dam is there. If she goes into the base of mikdash, she's chayiv because she's tamei. The sarvin of us at truma, and we would be served the truma. Meaning, we're proving Rav Chanina that it's a vadai that this woman is a need. As Rava explains, Vama Rava Shmaminam de Rav Chia Talas. For this dinner Rav Chia, we learn three things. Number one, Shamina Roiv v'Karaiv. We see that when we have the Rav, the Karv, we go after the Rav. Shmamina Ruba Darais. So Shmamina Isa Lidarav Zera. That what Rav Zera Afal Bishat Lasais Medina Neulais. Says Rav Zera, even though the gates of the city are locked, still the Isha the Chidalsos Medina Neulais Damya, and yet still, we're going to follow the Roiv. Now, what's going on over here is, without making this too complicated, these are of the largest sugyas in Shas. Rashi says, Isa Rav Zera. Let's take a moment to look at that Rashi towards the narrow lines. Rashi says, in the classical case of Teisha Chanuyais, Ubenim Salachach Arayv, and it's a motad avish, it's losses Medina Neulais. Therefore, what? The lesa elachan rubel achshira. Rayvair. Sheish Chanuyais Shabam, Cheres Basra Shchuta, Vachs, Cheres Nevela. Tika Milsa, Divinan Bay, Tarti Rubai. Ktamina Nasla, Ki going to the losses Medina Psuchas, Rev Tabachim, Sviva is Medina Israel. Tika Lamazin Basra Rubai, Dachshira Rubai, Yair, Rev Abam, Mechutzalah. So if Zera says, even though you only have one Rive, we still follow that Rive. So says Rava, the same thing in our case. So now, many people are wondering at this point that Rava was very interesting what he said. Rava responded, don't bring a raya because it's a Rive and a matzui. But then when Rava commented, Rava didn't mention the word matzui. Asks the Gemara of Rava who to come Rive matzui. Lekalaman damar. But then Rava left out the matzui afterwards. Says the Gemara, Hadve Rava Mehi. Rava was chayzer. And indeed, Rava went with Abaya's raya to Rav Chanina that this is a classical case of a Rav and a Matzoi, and we would follow the Rav. Continues the Gemara. This din of Rav Chanina is really a machlekes amoy royim. Itmar chavish shesafa b'nahar. We have a barrel that is floating in the river. We do not know what this barrel is. Amar Rav, says Rav. Nimseis keneged ir sheruba Yisrael. If you find this barrel opposite a city which is Rav Yidin, mutter keneged ruba nachrib asira. That's Rav. Shmuel Amar comes like Shmuel and he says afilu nimsa keneged ruba Yisrael asira. Why? Emer mehaydekara asyai. Says Shmuel, you know why? Because Haidekira Asoy, it came from Haidekira, a non-Jewish place that was on the banks. And therefore, says Shmuel, it's going to be Aser. So suggests the Gemara, what is this machlekes Rav and Shmuel about this barrel? Seemingly, the Gemara would like to suggest, it's machlekes in Rav Chanina. Demar Islay Rav Chanina. Shmuel, who says it's Aser, holds like Rav Chanina. Rav and Kara, if you're going to go Basra the Rav. So even though it's Kara to the Jewish city, but the Rav is not. So therefore it's possible. Umar and Rav, less than Rav Chanina. And Rav does not hold the Rav Chanina. Therefore, if it's a karev to a Jewish city, it's going to be mutter. Says the Gemara, no raya. Loi. The Kuliyam is like Rav Chanina. What's going on over here? The Rav holds them east of the cross. So if it came from that not Jewish place, Akuli B'shuri Have. If it would have come from there, all the stagnant bodies of water, having mitabi law would have prevented it. Meaning, says Rav, we have a situational raya from the fact that it's in this river. The talking about the Euphrates River. Says Rav, there's no way it came from that place, Haidikara, because it never would have gotten there. Umar Savar and Shmuel Chariva Denar. Nokad va'aser. The charifas, the swiftness, caught it up and brought it over. So they're arguing at a sidebar, but they're not arguing within the din of Rabbi Chanina. Hahu chatzba. Says the Gemara, there was a chatzba de chamara de shachel bepardisa de arla. There was a barrel of wine that was found in the vineyards of Arla, and you don't know whether the wine came from this vineyard, and therefore it should be Arla, or it came from somewhere else. Sharya Ravina. Ravina held its mutter. Says the Gemara, maybe you know why Ravina held its mutter. Because he holds like Rav Chanina Ravin Karav, he goes past the Rav. And therefore, Rav is certainly not Arla. So even though the Karav, the field that it's sitting in is all Arla, we could assume that no, it came Basra from the Rav of the world, therefore it's not Arla. Says the Gemara, Shiny Hasam no Raya di Mignav Mina Sanuye Bigave Loy Mitzan di Mignav Mina Atsnuye Bigave Loy Mitzane. We wouldn't hide it there. So says the Gemara, if this barrel was stolen from that vineyard, they would never have hid it in the same vineyard. And therefore, Bahani Mili says the Gemara, Chamra aval inve mitzni, but grapes they would indeed hide over there. So again, a situational raya as to the din. Says the Gemara, another case which we could try to utilize the din of Rav Chanina. Hanu ziki de chamra. 3 lines to the bottom of Chavdalim and Aleph. Leather bags of wine that were found between the vines of a vineyard. The question is, whose bags of wine are these? Sharinu Rava said it's a mutter. Why did Rava say it's a mutter? Lema, should we suggest, like Rav Chanina? He doesn't know the Rav Chanina. Why? Because this was a vineyard, of Yidden. So says the Gemara, sounds like, as the bottom Rashi speaks out, he goes Basra the Karoif, the field that it's in, which is Jewish, and not Basra the Roif. Says the Gemara, shiny asam no raya. Why? Deruba, because the majority in this area, as we turn over to Chavdalim and Beis, the Shafucha Yisrael Ninu. The majority of people who put wine into bags are Yidden. And therefore, the Raiv would dictate that it is kosher, and not only the fact that it was in a field that was kosher. So the fact that he said it's a mutter is not just because of a karaiv, could be because of the raiv as well. Vahani Mili says the Gemara, Barav Ravi says only large bags, Aval Zutri, but small bags, Ima, we could say, me Oivrei Devachim Nafal, that it fell from Oivrei Devachim, it fell from travelers. V'ika Rav Ravi, and says the Gemara, and if there are large bags together with the small bags, then we could say that it was there just to balance. So again, says the Gemara, that will be how we can learn up this brisa. Continues the Mishnah on Chavdalim Beis, and of course, let's just be honest, we did not do justice that previous sugya. This is one of the largest sugyas, Raiv and Karaiv, what to do with them. So says the Gemara, we had Rav Chanina, we had a bunch of rayos, and we will move on. Continues the Mishnah. Marchikin es ha'ilon min ha'ir. Continues the Mishnah, going back to our original discussion, which is distancing items from a neighbor's property. So marchikin es ha'ilon min ha'ir esrim v'chamesh amo. One has to distance a tree from a city 25 amos to b'charav shikma. If it's a charov, if it's a carob tree, or if it's a shikma, it's a sycamore tree, then chamishim amo. 50 amos, you need to distance it. Abashal Oimer says Abashal Kol Ilan Sirak Chamishem Amo. Any barren tree needs to be distanced 50 amos. The reason being, says Rashi, because it's a genayu le'ir, it doesn't look pretty, it's not nice to have these trees without fruits in such proximity to the city. Kadma, if the city was there first and you only put the trees later, he has to cut down the tree, and the city doesn't have to pay for him. But if the tree was there, the city could demand them cut down the tree, but they have to pay. If we're not sure which came first, then indeed you have to cut it down and you do not have to compensate. Says the Gemara, my time, what's this din in the Mishnah? Do you have to distance your trees from the city, Chamishim or 25 amos, Amar Ula, Misham Noi Ha'ir. Because the beauty of the city, it's not pretty to have these trees in such proximity to the city. Says the Gemara, V'tepik lei. Why don't we also say migrash, that they're not allowed to turn fields on the outskirts of cities into a migrash? Migrash sadeh. You're not allowed to turn a migrash into sadeh. That's a halacha and a different Mishnah. That you're not allowed to plant within 1,000 amos of the borders of the city, because you have the nice field around the city. You're not allowed to make those into tree-filled areas. So our Mishnah is saying that only 25 amos, 50 amos. We have another Mishnah that requires a much larger distance. Answers the Gemara like Tzricha le Rav Elazar. Our Mishnah follows Rav Elazar. Da'amar. Rav Elazar argued on that Mishnah, and he said, Sada migrash, a migrash sada. You're allowed to indeed make the sadas into a migrash, and the migrash into the sada. Our Mishnah is a different nikuda. Is teaching us, due to the beauty of the city, you can't put it there. Before we continue, let's quickly take a moment to look at directly Rashi quotes about the Sada Migrash. Rashi says it's a Mishnah on the last parak of Erichin, that a migrash is elef amma. Chol elef amma osir la'aslisei sadeh. V'kol sal gedaitach, and the havamin of our Gemara is, what does it mean you're not allowed to make a sadeh within 1,000 amos of the city? Lo sadeh lavan, lo sadeh ilan, not for grains, not for trees. So answers the Gemara, Rav Elazar disagreed. So our Mishnah could go with Rav Elazar that you're not allowed to plant these trees because it's not beautiful. Well, the Rabbanan Nami continues the Gemara, even the Rabbanan of that Mishnah in Erichin, Hani Mili Ziraim, only planting grains. Avali Lanais Avdinon, you're allowed to plant trees. V'hacham Mishamna here, and our Mishnah is teaching us you're allowed to plant trees. But due to the beauty of a city, you cannot plant within 25 or 50 amos. Says the Gemara Menat Temra. Where do we know to be machalik like this, that there's a difference between grains and trees with regard to planting right outside the city? The shiny being Zoyan Lilanis, the Tanya, because we learned in a Brisa. Karfev Yaiser mi Beisa Sayim. A Karfev, which is larger than 2 Beisa, Shahukaf Ladira, that was surrounded to use as a dira, was surrounded to use as a residential living area. Nizra Rubai. The majority of it was planted. Hareo Kigina has the din of a Gina, the Aser, meaning, and you're not allowed to carry in that area. Why? Because clearly if it's planted with seed, you're not going to actually live there. Why are you not going to live there? Because you don't live in a garden. Because you don't live in a garden, it's clear that this area is not suitable for living, so you can't carry in it. Whereas Nita Arubai, whereas it's mostly planted with trees, and then Umater, you are allowed to plant in it. Why? Because people walk in such an area, so it retains its din of a karfef, and therefore you could carry in it. What do we see in this brisa? We see the difference between seed and trees. We see that planting grains more hinders the usage of the area more than planting trees, and that is the reason why, in the case of our Mishnah, we can differentiate between our Mishnah and Mishnah Erichin between grains and trees. So we continue 3 lines from the white lines. We said if the city came first, then you stipulate and you do not have to give any money. Says the Gemara, Maishna. Let's pulse back to the beginning of the Pesachta. Kabe bar tekatani. What do we learn about bar and daf chavei? Actually, not going backwards. This is what we're going to learn in tomorrow's daf on daf chavei. Kaitzeitz v'naisi damim. you stipulate you have to pay for it. Says the Gemara, what is the difference between our din of a bar, between our din of a tree, and the next din of a bar? Amar Rav Kahana on the first white line, Kedera the Bei Shotvi Loi Mechamimi V'Loi Kriya. A pot of two people does not boil, nor does it cool, because each one relies on the other one to do the necessary work, and therefore, the only way that we would require someone to cut down a tree would be to pay him. You would never cut it down. And that is the reason why in our Mishnah, we said there's no money paid for cutting down the tree. Says the Gemara, my kusha, what was your original kasha on the second white line? Delma Shiny is Zeka de Rabim, Zeka de Yachid. The next Mishnah is going to be talking about Zeka de Yachid. That's the case of a bar. Our Mishnah is Zeka de Rabim. Aliyitmar de Rav Kahana, Seif Itmar. What did Rav Kahana mean when he asked originally from the case of bar and answer the difference between a keder de beishotfi, that it's not going to boil, meaning that you need to sometimes not give someone payment so that he'll do the job. Why does he say havali bereisha demei v'ader ekutz? Why doesn't he first say pay me and then I'll cut down my tree? Why does it say you first cut it down and then you get the payment? You first have to do it and then you will get the money afterwards. Says the Gemara, Safik Zekodim, the last case in the Mishnah. What's the din? Ask the Gemara again, mi bar what's the reason that when it comes to the bar, the Mishnah says we're not sure which one came first, you don't have to cut it down, whereas by us you do. Hasam devadei love. Hasam devadei, over there in the case of the bar, the tree came before the pit. Lav lemekatz. Therefore, you don't have to cut down the tree. Sveikanami, therefore, as well, in a case of a Savik Loy, Amrina Lake Koitz, we don't tell you to cut it down. Hacha devada lemekatz. Over here, if it for sure came first, you have to cut it down. Sveikanami, Amrina Lake Koitz, Misham Demei, Amrina Lake Icy Raya Vishakla. And if you're worried about the money, we tell him, okay, so to bring us a proof, and then we'll compensate you accordingly. We continue. We'll just begin the Mishnah, and then we will pick up for the Gemara in the next. Actually, no. We're gonna. What time is it? Yeah, we have the time. Says the Mishnah, granary. You have to distance 50 amos from the city. One is not allowed to make a permanent granary within his own property. Unless he's 50 amos on each side. And you have to distance the granary from your friends, small netiyai, small trees, or from his plowed field, so that the granary does not damage your friends' areas. Says the Gemara, Maishna Reisha, Maishna Seifa. What's the difference between the Reisha? What's the difference between the Seifa? The Reisha said you have to have 50 amais and everything's okay, whereas the Seifa doesn't say such a measurement. Says the Gemara, the Seifa is talking about a temporary granary, and therefore you don't need as much area. Hechidami, says the Gemara, what's the case of a garin she'ena kavua? What's the difference? Any granary that a shovel is not used, that's called a small, a temporary one. Meaning, if you have to use a shovel to winnow all the grain, then that means it's permanent. If not, it's going to be temporary. Rav Ashi Amar, my tam kamar. Says Rav Ashi, another way of learning the Mishnah is that it's explaining itself. What's the reason the ratio says you have to distance? A permanent granary 50 amos, so it does not damage. So the end of the Mishnah is not saying a separate case, but rather just explaining the first part of the Mishnah. Meisvei, ask the Gemara on Abaye. Abaye was the first shot, and Abaye said that the Seif is Asa Nagarin Kavua. Again, we had two pshatim in the Mishnah. We had Abaye, and we had Rav Ashi. So ask the Gemara and Abaye, Meisvei Marchikin as Nagarin Kavua. Menir Chamisha Mambok, Shesha Marchikin, Menir Chamisha Mambok, Kach Marchikin, Mitaluya, Mekuchusav, and Etiosav, or Menir Shachavir Chamisha Mambok. Says the Braisa, you also have to distance not only from the city 50 amos, but from the plantings, the saplings, the cucumbers, the gourds, the loud fields, Kadesh Lo Yasik. So Be'esham the Rav Ashi Nicha, because the Seif was explaining the Reisha. Elala Abaye Kasher, according to Abaye Shver. Says the Gemara, Kasha. We conclude. I understand why if this is for the cucumbers and the gourds. To azal avka, because the chaff goes va'asei belibe umatzile, and it reaches the plant and it dries it out. Elaminira, am I? What if the distance away from the plowed fields of your friend? Says the Gemara, you know what the reason is we turn over to Chavei Amid Aleph Mimnei She'oise Oisoi Golal. Because the chaff, when it falls into the plow field, what happens? It makes it into galal, it makes it into, as the top Rashi explains, it makes it into manure. Like, let's look at the top Rashi as we call it a day. Marbeloi zevel v'seifis azraim shenizra boy. It increases the manure, which ruins the field, and that's the reason why you're not allowed to put it in a plowed field, and you have to distance away from the plowed field such a distance.